Welcome to Convos from the Couch by Lifestance Health, where leading mental health professionals help guide you on your journey to a healthier, more fulfilling life. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Convos from the Couch by Lifestance Health. I'm Nicolette Lianza, and on this episode, I'll be talking with Carolyn Erbaugh, a clinician from our Brecksville, Ohio office, and she'll help us to understand more about codependency. So welcome, Carolyn. Great to have you on.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Codependency, I think, are one of those tricky things for people to really understand. So I'm really glad we're having this conversation to help you clarify what it is and what it can look like in relationships. So thank you again for being on.
Absolutely. It's a very, it can be very complex topic.
Good word for
and,
it.
Complex and it can be difficult to understand.
And that's the point right there. I think just the difficulty in understanding it. So I'm glad we're going to be diving more into that. But first, let's have you tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, yeah. Well, I've been with Lifestance for about 4 years. I am a DBT informed clinician at the Brecksville office location. And I serve adult populations in various life stages who tend to be challenged by social anxiety, lack of assertiveness, boundary setting issues, emotional regulation, and communication in relationships.
So with all that, it sounds like you probably also help your clients navigate maybe some codependency issues they might have, or what they're navigating maybe with others, perhaps.
Oh yeah, it overlaps a lot of different cuts across, and overlaps with a lot of different other issues.
Yeah, I definitely think so. So jumping in, tell us, what is codependency?
Well, I think there's a couple different ways that it can be, characterized. And I would also say that there are probably different types of codependency. But having said that, I'd probably define codependency as, someone who finds themselves in a relationship where they're giving to someone who doesn't need to be rescued, inappropriate limits to giving or overgiving, often rescuing or caretaking out of guilt, resentment when giving to someone. And also, in general, it's defined by a relationship that usually has poor boundaries.
So I'm sure we'll be talking more about boundaries as we continue our conversation. So what are some signs people can look for that might signal a codependent relationship?
Well, there are two, and in no order. There's typically an imbalance, often an imbalance of power or respect, where, sometimes we find one individual is more passive and submissive, and the other might be more dominant or controlling. So we'll see that. Or one in which healthy expectations for individual needs and responsibilities for one's own well-being haven't been established or are imbalanced. Also, we could look to things like feelings of anxiousness, trouble being alone, or feeling like their needs are selfish.
How does someone become codependent?
Well, the answer to this is somewhat complex, but I'd say the main reason this often happens is, it's a result of a combination of, unhealthy attachments to abusive people. And I think that what my understanding is what I see is that a lot of this is linked to adverse childhood experiences and attachments. Which then form, it then forms vulnerabilities, specific vulnerabilities, out of being a survivor or witness to codependence of other abusive family relationships.
Would that be what you're describing right there, role modeling of codependence and seeing it in maybe their parents or others?
You
things
got
like
it.
that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Where we see just like a mirroring of these, a witness to this. So there's a lot of history of trauma, and abuse, where we see someone might potentially come from that. I do see that there's definitely a correlation or a link to that there.
And I think a point you're bringing up of adverse childhood experiences, looking at potential trauma as one of the reasons why someone might show codependency towards others or likewise. So I
Oh,
think that's such a key
absolutely.
point that you're emphasizing that.
Oh,
Are
it
there
is, right?
other reasons you're seeing?
Well, yeah, there's an and then just related to this and what you were saying too, certainly, there becomes an excessive need for external validation and worth. Everything's externalized. We talk about, self-validation in DBT a lot, which is one of the key concepts. But they tend to have a feeling of responsibility for someone else's emotional well-being, and sometimes even a fear of abandonment, if that makes sense.
Yes, yeah. Part of the example I'm thinking is if I'm feeling, it's almost like how I've interpreted codependence. So one aspect of codependency is that I'm taking on the emotions of the other person I'm in the relationship. So if they're angry, I'm angry too. Is that how you've also come to see
Absolutely.
it?
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. They really, tend to take on others, absorbing someone else's emotions. And
That's a great word, absorbing it.
yeah.
Definitely. So why do people stay in codependent relationships?
Realize that they're in a codependent relationships, or they have a clue, or have concern about where they stand, where they are in the relationship. You know we can talk about their having their own depression, their own anxiety that they're contending with, usually at that point. Low self-worth. um Again, fears of being on their own,
Yeah.
or that's a big one. Fear of being on their own. They've gotten used to being treated this way, so they just don't really have that perspective, kind of lost the ability to have insight or perspective on who they are. So
Mhm.
it's really hard. There's like a loss of a sense of self.
And with that, so then if you don't know who you are with that, without that other person, is that another way of putting it?
Yeah.
Right. So that's going to
Yeah.
really keep me from wanting to leave them if I don't even know who I am without this person. So we know how
Yeah.
complex it can be, the reasons why people don't leave relationships in general, especially if they are, abusive or codependent. I mean, there could be so many layers of different reasons for it.
Oh,
Even
absolutely.
financial ties of like,
Hmm.
not being able to leave because financially, maybe you wouldn't be able to make it on your own and stuff.
That's a good point. Yeah, that like the financial piece for some people, you know what I mean? That
Hmm.
puts them at greater risk and vulnerability, in addition to everything else. But that would be another area in which someone would, feel codependent. Mhm.
I'm thinking of a line from the film Jerry Maguire, where the line is, "You complete me." And I think back when that film was out, that was like seemed as like the most romantic thing. And really what we've come to understand as therapists, what's healthy in relationships as two distinct individuals and not the
Yeah.
melding into one. You complete me. There's a missing piece to me that you complete. And I think that's where boundaries come in, right? Where do I end and you begin? So let's kind of shift gears and talk about that. How does the lack of boundaries play into codependency?
Yeah. Well, they have, these are people who have a hard time, setting boundaries. They didn't have a model of how to ever set boundaries. It could be because, they're passive, they ignore, or, they idealize the person, right?
Right.
Or they ignore, they don't see the early warning signs there.
Hmm.
Maybe because they're attached to someone else who has poor boundaries also. Um, but ultimately, boundaries are really important because they protect and free a person to express love, without being taken advantage of. or, being abused. So essentially it sets up rules and healthy expectations of treatment and respect, which maintains equal power and protects safety and integrity of the individual. So this needs to be assertively expressed and respected to have a healthy, functional relationship.
And again, if that wasn't
Yeah.
modeled to you in childhood or when you're younger, again, even poor boundaries, that's going to play out in your own relationships as an adult.
To some extent. I think there's a lot of, that's what I see. There's a lot of truth to that. So this is where we're working on assertiveness, and we'll talk about that. But, the lack of boundaries plays into codependency, because people who don't establish this tend to wind up in relationships where they, again, feel the need to rescue, caretake, responsible for others, or blame themselves, and then their own needs aren't considered or taken seriously at that point. So I know I just said a lot there.
No, that was great.
It does have a lot, you know what I mean? It has a lot to do with it.
And this is the complexity to it. Right.
Absolutely.
What is people pleasing, and how is it connected to codependency?
Well, people pleasers, I see a lot of these. People pleasers and overgivers, they tend to be more vulnerable to codependency, because they tend to believe that their worth or value is dependent, again, on this external validation, or approval. And so, or when they're overgiving and pleasing, as maybe it evolved as a way to cope, they tend to put others first before themselves. And many of them are taught that they should trust other people more than themselves too. And sometimes, they just serve the expectations of others. It's really what it is at that point, if that makes sense.
That does. I see people pleasers as the ones giving and giving and giving, but then there's nothing even left for them, and even the sense of who they are. And so I think at first look, you think people pleasing, maybe that's not such a bad thing. You want to, help others and please them. But this is where it gets to a point where you're giving and giving in against your own of what's best for you.
That's exactly it. That it gets to a point, it's one thing to be a kind-hearted, giving, loving person, but not to the detriment of, observing and expressing your own needs. And then if we're at the point where we're sacrificing, now we've got a real problem. And, other people, you got to teach other people how to treat you.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a key one right there. You got to teach other people how to treat you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and standing up for what
that's the assertiveness.
Exactly, and so that's how it's connected to that.
Yeah. So, what are some tips to help someone overcome codependency?
Yeah, well, I think I mentioned some things already, but I think that the main things really here are being aware of tendencies to overgive or people please. That would be one. Mm-hmm. Building insight on vulnerabilities to codependency based on excessive need for external validation. That would be another one. Working through trauma issues.
It's a big
obviously
one too.
Working through that, and or addiction, because there's a lot there. That's another
point.
Sidebar, but definitely related. Working on establishing ways to set healthy boundaries with assertiveness skills training, or like the interpersonal effectiveness that I focus on so much with people in DBT, and a couple other things. Exploring and defining or redefining what a healthy relationship looks like to a person, and how to recognize when a relationship is becoming imbalanced or abusive.
That's a key point too, when to recognize when it is.
Yeah. And then finally, building on your own sense of trusting yourself and developing healthy expectations of yourself and others in relationships.
Those are great tips. Take a lot of work to really navigate and be able to practice doing those, but those are really, really great tips.
Yeah, and that's what we do. That's what I feel like a
Exactly.
lot of what I'm doing is helping people navigate this, right? As a
Mhm.
guide,
Mhm.
towards like just they're the experts on themselves and their stock, and we just need to help them get unstuck. So,
Exactly.
right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, 100%, Carolyn, 100%. Any other takeaways you'd like to share about codependency?
I think my last statement and point I want to make with this really is that developing assertiveness and, being able to develop a sense of assertiveness and sense of respect, self-respect and self-worth are essential to establish and maintain healthy, functional relationships, and they are the antidotes to preventing or reducing codependent behaviors. That's the
Thank
big takeaway
you.
here, I think. Yeah, you're welcome.
That is a great takeaway. I appreciate you sharing your knowledge on this tricky topic. And I think you definitely help clarify for our listeners more about what this is and what it can look like and the tips to overcome it. So thank you again for sharing, Carolyn.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you for having me here.
I would like to thank the team behind the Covers from the Couch podcast, Jason Clayton, Chris Kelman, and Juliana Whitten. Take care, everyone.